So we're going to talk about skin. It is real. It's the shortest unit, like by any measures. Okay, very relaxed. Okay, there's not much to talk about really. Functionally, it's really hard to live without skin. Obviously, dehydration is going to go on. People with burns. Two main problems in burn victims: loss of water, skin doesn't protect anymore, and infections, of course. Okay, you kind of, when you think about what is the role of an organ, you have to think, what if I'm losing it? Like, what's going to happen to me? That makes sense? Like, what is if it doesn't work properly? Okay. So, thermoregulation, you sweat, but not only this. When you're cold, the blood vessels in your dermis, they constrict. This is why you look pale. Okay, and they conserve the they conserve the heat this way. When you hot, they dilate, and you start to throw off heat, like dissipate. Does that make sense? This is why if you want to, like we do a blood typing in the micro lab, I'm a lead instructor in micro. It doesn't bring any perks, just bragging rights. So we do blood typing, and I tell students, before you do the prick, rub your hands, warm them up, because when you warm them up, the blood flow increases, and you get more blood. Okay, good? Yeah. You can imply, identification purposes, all that kind of stuff. Like, you can even, one of the arguments that I've heard, even in reproduction, because skin is one of the defining external features of a human, and we humans pick up partners based on the external features to a large extent, so that can play role in picking the partner. That makes sense to you all? Okay, awesome. So, skin consists of two layers. The superficial layer, called epidermis, is stratified squamous epithelium, which is also keratinized, but it's like, okay. A lot of protein called keratin is involved here. So, when we say multiple layers, let's separate the structural layer and the functional layer. Let me explain, because I'm afraid I can cause even more confusion with that. But what I mean is, we're going to talk about 5 functional layers. But for instance, the outermost one, stratum corneum, itself has many layers of these same cells. Does that make sense? This is what the structural layer is. We're going to focus on the function here. So the deepest layer of that epithelium is stratum basale. Okay? Trying to make sure that I have all the space. So stratum basale, or basal layer, okay? It is the only layer with the dividing keratinocytes. So these are stem cells. Essentially, those are unipotent stem cells. Does that make sense? So, go ahead.
That's part of the epidermis?
Can't hear you.
Is that part of the epidermis?
Yeah. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go bottom one, then one above it, then one above it, then one above it, then one above it. Make sense? Okay. So this is your bottom one, stratum basale. Dividing keratinocytes, also Merkel cells. These are sensory cells. And melanocytes. I'm going to leave melanocytes for a little bit later in the conversation. Okay, we're good? Now, these dividing keratinocytes, they divide, obviously, and they're being pushed a little bit higher, forming so-called stratum spinosum. In this layer, keratinocytes are still living, so non-dividing, but living keratinocytes. And also so-called Langerhans cells. It's not an easy last name. Not worse than mine, though. Okay, so Langerhans cells are immune cells. Makes again perfect sense, because you damage your skin all the time, right? So pathogens can basically enter through, but here you have a surveyor. We clear so far? Okay, let's move on. These non-dividing keratinocytes constantly being pushed from the bottom, so they eventually move to the third layer, which is called stratum granulosum. It contains dying keratinocytes. So what happens? Look at the name, keratino. Keratin is the protein that slowly fills up the cells, suffocating all the organelles, so cells keep on dying, and when they are completely dead, they form stratum corneum. Dead keratinocytes. You with me? Okay, good. These keratinocytes are basically bags filled with keratin. You can see them. Here they are. Your skin is here. That's dead keratinocytes. By the time you leave this class, a couple of million those keratinocytes will be sitting on the floor under you. Yeah. There was an estimate that an average person, over time of life, on average, loses the amount of skin roughly equivalent to that person's weight. Over life, don't worry. Okay, it's not a reliable way for the body weight control. Now you may have noticed that I left a pretty huge gap here. So why? These 4 layers are found in what we call thin skin. It's most of your skin, except palms and soles. Okay? On the palms and soles, you have so-called thick skin, and there is one layer right here in the thick skin stratum lucidum, also dead keratinocytes. it provides additional UV protection because these keratinocytes are filled with a special protein called eladin. Don't worry about the name. Basically, what I want you to know that this layer is found only in a thick skin. And it's also totally dead. We're good? Oh, really important stuff. I want to put it out because I didn't do it yesterday. It was not super convenient. So I'm just going to remind you. Remember when we were talking about the structure of epithelium? I mentioned there's a basement membrane here. It's kind of important. It's kind of important. There's basement membrane here. Okay? So far, so good? Now, I know a lot of formal learning. We're going to take a little learning break. We're still going to learn some stuff, but in more conversational. So, I never said a word about melanocytes. What do? These cells produce pigment called melanin. And if you remember your previous biology classes, melanin is a protein, so you have a gene that encodes the protein melanin. Does that make sense? When this gene is expressed, the protein melanin is produced. And the level of expression of that gene, the amount of melanin, will determine our skin color, our hair color, and interestingly enough, our eye color. So, people that produce more melanin have darker skin. But what triggers the production of melanin? UV light. This protein protects against UV light. Does that make sense? Now, if you will look at the distribution of the skin color in people over the world, people who live closer to the equator, people who live in the areas with a lot of sun, originally, they have darker skin. Make sense? You go up north, like Sweden or Finland, those people are very fair-skinned because my former boss was Irish, and she used to call the gray color Irish green, okay? Because, or Irish blue, because she said the skies are always cloudy, okay? That makes sense to you? Now, what about folks that have albinism? What does that mean? Do they not have a gene? They do. They do have a gene. It's defective. They don't produce melanin at all. That makes sense? What about folks with vitiligo? Vitiligo, yeah. You know this patches? That specific part of the skin, gene's broken there. In those melanocytes specifically. Does that make sense? And speaking of eye color, it's not that we have different colored pigments. The more melanin, the more we tend to go brown-eyed. So like green eyes or gray or blue have low amounts of melanin. Brown eyes have high amounts of melanin. Does that part make sense? Okay. Now what lies on the basement membrane? This part is going to be dermis. Now I'm definitely not going to fit dermis here. So dermis is going to go right there. Thankfully, dermis is pretty small. I mean, there's not a lot to talk about, really. There are two layers. The superficial layer, which is papillary, and it's going to be loose areolar connective tissue. Okay. and reticular layer, which is dense, irregular connective tissue. Okay, good. So loose areolar in the papillary layer, dense irregular form reticular layer. If you look at the image, don't look at the images now, but when you will, in the lecture notes, you will notice that the basement membrane is not flat. It goes like this. So the extensions of epidermis, like finger-like extensions into papillary layer, called epidermal ridges, and extensions of that stuff, dermal papillae, and they hold with each other like this. Okay, provides extra kind of connection here. Make sense? There's not really anything interesting to talk about the layers per se. Most of the skin-associated structures are here. Okay? Ever heard the expression subcutaneous? The injection goes here. Not here, not here, here. Under the skin. Why? There's fat and a lot of blood vessels. So you inject the drug, it will be picked up and distributed, and it's easy. Okay? It's not like IV. Okay. Few kind of cheery notes. Superficial skin structures. Not the flexure lines, cleavage lines, and friction ridges. I tend to forget, go. Okay, friction ridges. Your fingers, your toes, your soles. Basically your fingerprints. That make sense? Why do we need them? Well, the name kind of explains it. Friction. They did not evolve so USCIS can easily identify immigrants, They are unique, but they allow you to grab things. Cleavage lines, really important. So, we just talked about dense irregular, right? So collagen fibers are kind of stochastic in terms of the direction. But they really are not. So there is some dominant direction of those fibers. Are you following me? And in different parts of the skin, they're slightly different. So basically, a surgeon, before making an incision, needs to know the main orientation of collagen fibers. Because the fibers are like this, and you cut along the fibers, then the wound will be really neat and tiny. That makes sense? Really narrow, and you can easily stitch it back. But if you cut across the fibers, then they will just pull the ends of the wound. It will be gap, and you will have hard time stitching it back, and it will have hard time healing. Make sense? Now, one of top 2 stupid structures found in the skin, well, top 3, okay, flexure lines. All of this, like this stuff here, flexure lines, when you bend your joints, skin cannot be super tight. It has to accommodate the movement. That's it. So there's no super importance to them. Now the top, it's a second in the stupid structures. Well, maybe, yeah, probably second. Because number 1 is a nail. I despise nails. So we're getting very quick. There's no physiology about the nails. None. Okay? Anatomically, it's all there. Probably the only physiological thing that you need to know, which part of the nail is responsible for growth. It's a nail bed. Okay? Which is if you flip it, which I don't recommend, that's going to be under the nail. Make sense? Nails can recover, you can lose them, but I really, they're not super interesting. So, yeah, this is called the edge, nail fold that holds it in, hyponychium, which I apparently don't have because I didn't grow them that far, but that under the edge of the nail is thick layer called hyponychium. Lunule, a little bit of the thick part called eponychium. Seriously, why? Now, third, the most stupid structure on the skin is hair. We don't need them. You understand it, right? We don't need hair. Hair is useless. Facial hair is useless. Cranial hair is useless. And body hair is the most useless of them all. What is the function of hair in animals? When they get scared or cold, they expand them. When they're cold and they expand them, they increase insulation. When they're scared and they expand them, the hair sticks out. They fluff the hair. They appear bigger, and that's supposed to scare the attacker, whatever. We can't do that. They're not providing us with any warmth, or they can scare the attacker. So they essentially useless. Okay? But we're still going to talk a little bit about them. So when we talk about hair, if that's the skin surface, okay, you've got it's very, very, very crude illustration. So this part here, above, what you see on the hair is a shaft. Hair shaft. What you don't is the root. Okay, that makes sense? Now this part, this little bulb at the bottom, is usually called a hair follicle. Now, how does the hair grow? Hair is the part of the skin. It is actually an extension of the epidermis. There are basal cells right here called the hair matrix. They divide. Those are keratinocytes. They divide and they push the hair out. Does that make sense? Push it out and it grows and it grows and it grows. What happens to keratinocytes when they're being pushed out? They die. Your hair is dead. And when you see an ad for a shampoo, well, I used to see them. I don't watch them anymore for obvious reasons. But when you watch the ad and they say, we're going to revitalize your hair, they basically suggest raising the dead. Okay, that's not going to happen. Obviously, since epidermis is epithelial tissue, it is not vascularized. You gotta have some cells. You gotta have some structures that will bring oxygen and nutrients. So that layer right here is called hair papilla. Blood vessels, all that kind of stuff. Okay? We good so far? When you shave your hair, you cut the shaft. When you pull the hair, yeah, you remove the entire thing, but some keratinocytes will remain and it will grow back. When somebody receives chemotherapy for cancer, chemotherapy kills fast dividing cells, which are cells of the matrix. But once the chemotherapy stops, stem cells will produce this keratinocytes and the hair will start growing again. Does that make sense? As long as there's blood supply, it's going to grow. The only reliable way, as you all know, probably, you blast it with a laser, killing everything here. Okay, the entire thing. including patho. Does that make sense? Questions so far? Questions? Okay. Couple more structures, kind of, nothing fancy. Rectopili muscle. Name can say a lot. It's actually attached to the hair. Okay? So, erector, it erects, lifts up. Pili, hair. So muscle that lifts up hair. That's the muscle responsible for goosebumps. And it can be triggered, as we discussed, excitement or fear or cold, right? Useless, but you can't do it voluntarily. Okay, good so far? And sensory receptors. Spare me from explanation what they do. Sensory receptors, they sense. We're going to talk a lot about them in the Unit 3. Okay, we got this, hair. Glands. Everybody, remember we're talking about skin glands when we talked about epithelium? Know them 3. Merocrine sweat, apocrine sweat, sebaceous. Sebaceous is actually sitting right around here. And they release that oily stuff onto the hair and the skin. So for instance, people with oilier skin often have to wash their hair more often so they don't look greasy, right? Production is dramatically increased during puberty, and this is why people get acne, because there are bacteria living in the follicle. And when the sebum production explodes, they have a field day and just reproduce like crazy, and there's an inflammation. Okay. We're good? Okay. Let's talk some fun. And by fun, I mean pathologies. Okay, so I don't need hair. So we're going to start with some... Well, I divided it really nicely yesterday. I'm going to do it the same way. So I'm going to do non-infectious first. Since I told you that everything that I can ask an exam is in the lecture notes and often here, I'm going to be very explicit what's not going to be on the exam. So eczema can be. It's usually inflammatory condition, okay? Skin inflammation. Can be a result of an allergy, can be a result of the over-drying, just inflammation, okay? Now, just for the sake of it, I'm not going to put this on the list. It's not on the exam, but it's a real nice physiological explanation. Psoriasis. Everybody heard about it? It's autoimmune condition in which your immune cells, for reasons that we really don't know, attack your basement membrane. That makes sense? And you have massive inflammation here. That's it. How you treat psoriasis? By immunosuppressants. Because we don't know why they do it. Burns. Okay. There are 4 degrees. Okay, so I'm not going to write the word degree. So first, epidermis. If you grab, I don't know, accidentally touch a hot skillet, that's your first degree burn. Really like redness and pain. If you think that when you get a burn, like really minor, it's the best treatment. I know because a surgeon that worked in a burn unit. a friend of mine. Cold water. How long? No less than 10 minutes. Running cold water, no less than 10, really. It's not for the exam, it's for your own sake, okay? It works. We checked. Not deliberately, no. Second degree. Epidermis and dermis are affected. It's a blister, painful, very unpleasant. A friend of mine, way back, she got her entire face second-degree burn. It was very, very dramatic. Okay. Everything healed perfectly fine. She absolutely, but when I first time saw her, oh my God, that was. Third degree. Epidermis, dermis, subcutaneous. The depth varies, but basically at this point, look, this stuff's gone. I mean, it's not just affected. In the third degree burn, you have a picture in the slides. Skin's dead, and like connective tissue under it, like fat and muscle, still there, but pretty much dead. So what do you do in this case? Remove the dead tissue, hoping that there's enough left, and you transplant skin, usually from the butt or the back. This is why it's so hard to treat huge burns, because the patient does not have enough skin to donate to him or herself. Okay? And the fourth, I don't want it to sound funny. It's not. It's just the term that I use, maybe not too sensitive, but it's charcoal. That's the level to which the tissue is burned. It's basically cold at this point. There's nothing left. It's amputation. Like, there's no salvation. You cannot. There's nothing to transplant on. Does that make sense? What do you need to know about the burns? The rule of nines. It's all there. Memorize. Basically, body percentages. 4.5, 4.5. 18, 18. 4.5, 4.5. And legs, anterior is 9, posterior is 9. Does that make sense? So if I ask you, the person has an entire leg burned. What's the percentage? You think, okay, 9, 18%. Does that make sense? So be able to do that, numbers are going to be very, very straightforward. If you know the distribution, you know the distribution. If you add them all up, you will get 99%. 1% that's left is the perineum. It's the place right here between the... So basically, external genitalia, anal orifice, place between them, between the legs. Make sense? I'm going to list cancers. So you have basal cell carcinoma, squamous cell carcinoma, melanoma. Very light, surgical removal, almost never metastasizes, very good prognosis. Okay, I know people who were diagnosed with basal cell carcinoma, went to a physician in the morning, got it removed, get back to work. It's like super straightforward. Squamous cell carcinoma can metastasize more frequently, kind of in the middle, still treatable, early diagnostic is the key. Melanoma, bad, very bad. especially if it's not picked up early. So late stage melanoma usually spreads throughout the body and very hard to treat. There are some drugs that are quite effective. Okay? You good so far? Infectious. There's a separate class for it. It's called microbiology class. So I'm not going to run with it, okay, for a long time. So basically, there are several conditions that I mentioned in the lectures. Impetigo. Every condition that I mentioned is bacterial. Impetigo, very common in kids, nasty-looking patches on the skin, absolutely benign, spreads like wildfire. If one person on the football team has it, every person on the football team has it. Scalded skin syndrome. Now, this is a lovely story. Look. So the bacteria, you probably heard Staph aureus. So staph can produce so-called exfoliative toxin. Exfoliative toxin is in fact an enzyme that completely obliterates basement membrane. Remember, this is the wall, this is the foundation, right? If there's no foundation, wall's gone. So it is very common in newborns if they pick up Staph aureus in the hospital, and babies look like they were temporarily placed in a pot with boiling water. So the skin flakes off, the epidermis flakes off. They're really red, they scalded. It's very treatable. It looks much worse than it is. It's a very treatable condition. There are a couple of thousand cases every year in the United States. Okay, that was a challenge in spelling erysipelas. This is the infection of the dermis and subcutaneous tissue. Does that make sense? So at this point you have inflammation not on the skin but in the skin. So how are you going to feel? Tender, hot, swollen, red. All the signs of inflammation as usual. And just to scare the living daylights out of you, I don't know if I have a picture. It's technically not a skin infection, but it's always a result of the skin infection. Necrotizing fasciitis. When this infectious stuff gets through the epidermis, basement membrane into the dermis, and deeper. Now we're talking like subcutaneous tissues, muscles, and whatnot. Necrotizing fasciitis. Fasciitis. That's flesh-eating bacteria. Extremely rare in healthy people, mostly immunocompromised. Okay, but that's bad. What's the main risk factor for cancers? Huh?
You said the main risk.
Risk factor. What contributes to development of skin cancers?
Sunlight?
Yeah, UV light. Interestingly, the most recent studies suggest that only first two. Melanoma most likely is genetic. Does that make sense? It's just most recent stuff that came out. The very last concept that we're going to do before we take a little restroom break and come back and start moving microscopes around is the concept of the repair. I'm going to be very short and quick. It's one of the really, I consider, fundamental concepts, and skin is quite good to illustrate it. So imagine that you have skin that's been damaged. Okay, so you cut it. That makes sense? Like with a knife. accidentally. So you break through the epidermis and dermis. There are no blood vessels here, right? The only blood vessels that you can find will be around here. So when your cells get clobbered, they start releasing so it sets off the alarm, the inflammation. So inflammatory molecules there is a shit ton of them. Cytokines, chemokines, arachidonic acid metabolite, like interleukin, all kinds of stuff, leukotrienes, you name it. They rush into the blood and they serve the purpose of breadcrumbs in Hansel and Gretel. They guide white blood cells from the blood to the site of injury. Does that make sense? Now, a couple of things happen at this point. That point. First of all, your blood vessel dilates. It brings more blood, more white blood cells. That makes sense? Second, your blood vessel becomes more permeable. So white blood cells have easier time to get through the wall to the injury site. So far makes sense? When it becomes permeable, it's not only white blood cells. It's also plasma. It starts leaking. So you have fluid accumulating around the site of injury. When fluid accumulates in a tissue, what happens? Your tissue swells, edema. Okay? So we're gonna just that list is not going to be on the exam, but I just want to put it here, edema. When these blood vessels dilate, your skin becomes red. That makes sense? And all the fighting that goes on here, all these inflammatory molecules, especially like prostacyclins, they can increase the local temperature. So you have local fever. Right? Those inflammatory molecules and swelling both will act on the sensory receptors, causing pain. And these are 4 signs of inflammation: redness, fever, swelling, and pain. In fancy Latin, rubor, color, tumor, and dolor. Okay? Now, what else is happening? Okay, we got to fix this thing, right? So what happens? The white blood cells destroy the crap. Make sense? During that destruction, some of them die. This is how pus is formed. Okay, that makes sense? White blood cells, platelets come over, and they basically start coagulate right here. Coagulation not only prevents the blood leakage if you have a damaged blood vessel, it also traps all the stuff in that location so it doesn't spread. Make sense so far? And all that leaking plasma washes the crap away into the lymphatic system. It works perfectly. Now cells under the inflammatory stimuli start to produce various growth factors, and all of this forces fibroblasts to start patching the wound. Collagen fibers. Collagen fibers are produced, matrix is produced, like the whole thing is produced. And collagen fibers, they pull the ends of the wound together. Does that make sense? Once the connective tissue is restored and basement membrane is restored, then epithelium has something to grow on, and it just fills the gap. And you have real nice, pretty scar tissue. Or maybe not if it was a minor wound. And this is really important idea here that I was trying to come across. So you have injury that causes inflammation that results in the repair. Make sense? The whole idea? If it goes on properly, it's perfect. Right? Imagine that you don't have real injury, but your immune system thinks you do. So you have inflammation that results in the repair, and the repair may be pretty detrimental. Okay? Think of vasculitis, think of atherosclerosis, think of multiple sclerosis. There's no real injury, but there's plenty of inflammation. Does that make sense? And in some cases, you do have a legitimate injury, but the problem is, in some places, repair is bad. So imagine that somebody rams through that wall, which is concrete, right? And the construction company walks in, gets a whole bunch of old newspapers, and fills the gap. Technically, they repaired it, but they didn't do it right. This is what happens in some diseases. For instance, in stroke, there is an injury, there is an inflammation, there's going to be a repair, there's going to be scar tissue. It's not going to contain neurons. In heart attack, injury, inflammation, scar tissue is not going to contain any cardiomyocytes. It's going to be connective tissue. In most cases, scar tissue is connective. And it's not a great idea to repair muscle with a connective tissue, obviously. Questions? Okay, let's take a small break. I will